The late July sun beat down on the sprawling, manicured lawns of the First Cathedral of Grace with a suffocating, relentless heat. It was the afternoon of the annual Jubilee Church picnic, an event that, in our affluent Atlanta suburb, was less about fellowship and entirely about pageantry. The air was thick with the scent of hickory-smoked brisket, expensive floral perfumes, and the toxic, unspoken judgments of 500 congregants. Towering white event tents, imported at a premium just for this afternoon, provided shade for the church's elite. Crystal pitchers of iced sweet tea sweated on tables draped in heavy linen, while the congregation's wealthiest families held court in their Sunday best. At the dead center of it all, bathed in the golden hour light and the unearned adoration of the church elders, sat my sister, Caroline, and her 22-year-old daughter, Brittany. They were the picture-perfect illusion of Southern royalty. Caroline wore a wide-brimmed designer hat that cast a shadow over her judgmental, hawkish eyes, while Brittany fluttered around the pavilion in a silk sundress she had charged to a credit card she could never hope to pay off. For years, they had meticulously crafted a narrative within these church walls. Caroline was the devout, successful matriarch, and Brittany was the gifted, golden child scholar. And me? I was Elise, the quiet 32-year-old spinster aunt, the family's designated cautionary tale. According to Caroline's whispered prayer request and tragic sighs, I was a struggling, aimless disappointment who supposedly lived month to month in a tiny apartment, barely scraping by on data entry jobs. They needed me to be a failure, so their mediocre successes could look like absolute triumphs. I sat near the edge of the pavilion, at a small, wobbly folding table near the industrial fans. I didn't mind the heat, and I certainly didn't mind the distance from my family. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, the ice clinking softly against the glass. I wore simple slacks and a plain white blouse. I had no designer logos plastered across my chest. I had no desperate need to be seen. I just sat there, waiting. At 3 p.m., the picnic's main event began. The massive, high-definition LED Jumbotron, a testament to the church's multi-million-dollar renovation budget, hummed to life behind the grand outdoor stage. Pastor Vance, a man whose tailored suits cost more than most parishioners' cars, took to the podium to begin the afternoon announcements and the customary Family Blessings segment, where members could take the microphone to share lighthearted anecdotes or ask for the community's prayers. That was when Brittany saw her opportunity. She stood up, her high heels sinking slightly into the pristine grass, and marched toward the stage. Caroline beamed with pride, patting the hand of Deacon Miller next to her. Brittany took the heavy silver microphone from Pastor Vance, flashing a blinding, rehearsed smile at the crowd of hundreds. The feedback shrieked for a fraction of a second before her sickly sweet voice echoed across the massive pavilion. "Praise the Lord, everyone," Brittany cooed, her voice dripping with artificial innocence. "I just wanted to take a moment to ask for a special blessing today. A prayer, really, for my family, specifically for my Aunt Elise." Every head in the congregation turned toward the back of the tent. 500 pairs of eyes locked onto me. I didn't flinch. I just slowly lowered my glass to the table, my expression completely unreadable. Brittany gripped the microphone tighter, her smile twisting into a cruel, arrogant smirk. "You know, the Bible teaches us about charity and about carrying the heavy burdens of those who can't provide for themselves. And let me tell you, Aunt Elise is the heaviest burden of all." A few shocked gasps rippled through the front rows, but Brittany pressed on, emboldened by the spotlight. "I mean, she's 32. She has no husband, no career, and she still drives a car that looks like it barely survived the Bush administration." Brittany laughed, a sharp nasal sound. "We love her, of course we do. But it is just so exhausting having to constantly float her along. So, if we could all just bow our heads and pray that our beloved, broke burden of an aunt finally gets her life together so my mother can stop paying for her groceries, I would really appreciate it. The silence that followed was agonizing. And then, the worst sound imaginable erupted. Laughter. It started with a snicker from the youth group tables, then swelled into full-blown chuckles from the deacons and choir members. Caroline didn't reprimand her daughter. Instead, she brought a manicured hand to her chest, shaking her head in mock sorrow, playing the role of the long-suffering, generous saint to absolute perfection. The humiliation was designed to be absolute. It was designed to break me, to force me to run to the parking lot in tears, cementing my role as the pathetic loser of the family forever. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even look away. I leaned back in my cheap folding chair, crossed my legs, and adjusted my sunglasses. I reached into my understated leather tote bag, pulled out my phone, and sent a single, one-word text message to the church's chief financial officer. Now, up on the stage, Brittany was still basking in the glow of her cruel joke, handing the microphone back to Pastor Vance. But Pastor Vance wasn't smiling anymore. The color had completely drained from his face. He was staring down at his phone, his hands trembling so violently that the microphone rattled against his gold wedding band. He looked up at Brittany, his eyes wide with a sudden, suffocating terror. And then his gaze slowly, agonizingly, tracked across the sea of congregants until it locked dead onto me. "Brittany!" Pastor Vance interrupted, his voice cracking through the massive speakers, completely devoid of its usual booming confidence. He didn't even address the congregation. He just stared at me, sweat beading on his forehead. "Brittany, I need you to step down from the stage, right now." "What? Why?" Brittany scoffed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "I was just making a joke, Pastor. We're all family here." "I said step down!" Pastor Vance practically shouted, his voice echoing off the brick facade of the cathedral. The congregation froze. The laughter died instantly. Caroline stood up from her VIP table, her face twisting in confusion and outrage. But before she could speak, the massive 30-foot LED jumbotron behind the stage flickered. The church's logo vanished. In its place, a series of high-definition, unredacted documents suddenly flashed across the screen for all 500 people to see. There were property deeds. There were bank foreclosure notices. There were undeniable, stamped legal documents bearing the names of Caroline, Brittany, and the church's own executive board. The illusion was over, and the congregation was about to learn exactly who owned the ground they were standing on. Before I tell you exactly what those documents revealed, and before I describe the sheer, unadulterated panic that washed over my sister's face when she finally realized she had crossed the wrong woman, I need to step out of the story for just a moment and talk directly to you. If you're listening to this right now, chances are you already know the heavy, suffocating weight of the very scene I just described. You know what it feels like to sit at a table surrounded by people who share your blood, yet feel entirely, terrifyingly alone. You know the unique, sharp pain of being the family's designated scapegoat. Society constantly feeds us this toxic lie that family is everything and that blood is thicker than water. We are conditioned from a very young age to absorb the emotional abuse, to endure the passive-aggressive insults masked as jokes, and to silently fund the delusions of our relatives, all in the sacred name of keeping the peace. But what happens when keeping the peace means declaring war on your own mental health? What happens when you realize that your family doesn't actually love you? They only love what they can extract from you. There is a very specific type of exhaustion that comes from being the reliable one in a family of narcissists. You are the one expected to shrink yourself so they can feel big. You are expected to hide your successes so you don't trigger their insecurities. And you are expected to step up and open your wallet the moment their poor choices catch up to them. They will bleed you dry in the dark and then mock you for being empty in the light. But I am here to tell you today that the cycle ends the exact second you decide it does. If you have ever had to sit quietly while toxic family members underestimated your worth, belittled your existence, or treated you like a disposable resource, I need you to know that you are not alone. There is an entire army of us who have walked through that exact same fire and come out on the other side forged in absolute steel. Take a moment right now and let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Let's show each other how massive this community of survivors truly is. And if you have ever had to look an arrogant, entitled relative dead in the eye and teach them a brutal, unforgettable lesson about respect and boundaries, I need you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. We are building a sanctuary here for the independent, the strong, and the unbroken. Now, let me take you back a few years so you can fully understand the sheer magnitude of the trap my family had just walked blindly into. To understand the absolute poetic justice of what was unfolding on that 30-foot LED screen, you have to understand the toxic foundation upon which my entire family was built. I grew up in a sprawling faux colonial house in the wealthiest zip code in Georgia. From the outside, my parents, Richard and Eleanor, were the pinnacle of Southern high society. My father was an investment banker who cared more about his handicap at the country club than his children, and my mother was a ruthless socialite whose entire existence revolved around the approval of the country club board and the church elders. Our home was a cold, sterile museum of imported mahogany furniture, Persian rugs that we weren't allowed to step on, and crystal vases filled with white lilies that always smelled faintly like a funeral. In this museum of vanity, my older sister Caroline was the prized exhibit. From the moment she was born, Caroline was the undisputed golden child. She was handed the world on a silver platter and never once asked to wash the dishes. When Caroline turned 16, my parents bought her a brand new Mercedes-Benz convertible, complete with a massive red bow on the hood and a catered driveway party. When she barely scraped by in high school with C- grades, my father magically arranged for a hefty donation to ensure her acceptance into a prestigious private university. She majored in communications, spent 4 years partying on my parents' platinum credit cards, and graduated into a 6-figure job at my father's firm, a job where her only actual responsibility was planning the office holiday party. She was arrogant, she was lazy, and she was utterly incapable of surviving in the real world without a safety net of old money. But to my parents, she was flawless. And then there was me, Elise. The disappointment. I was 4 years younger, inherently quiet, and possessed the unforgivable trait of seeing right through my parents' shallow facade. I didn't care about designer labels or country club gossip. I cared about books. I cared about numbers. And I cared about escaping. While Caroline was treated like royalty, I was treated like the hired help. If the house needed cleaning before a gala, I was handed a mop, while Caroline was handed an appointment at the salon. When I turned 16, there was no car, no party, and no red bow. My father handed me a bus schedule and told me that struggle builds character. When I graduated at the top of my high school class as valedictorian, my parents skipped the ceremony because Caroline had a minor sinus infection and needed emotional support. They conditioned me to believe that my worth was directly tied to my utility. I was only valuable when I was useful, and I was only loved when I was silent. Things took a dark turn when my father suddenly passed away 5 years ago. The funeral was a lavish, ostentatious affair, but the reading of the will was a brutal awakening. My father, the supposedly brilliant investment banker, had been drowning in secret debt for decades. The country club memberships, Caroline's luxury cars, the designer clothes, it was all built on a terrifying mountain of high-interest loans and leveraged assets. My mother was completely unequipped to handle reality. Caroline, true to form, had a massive hysterical breakdown, furious that her inheritance was entirely non-existent. Within 6 months, the faux colonial house was foreclosed on, and the family was staring down the barrel of total, humiliating bankruptcy. That was when the dynamic shifted, though the outward illusion remained the exact same. I was 27 at the time. What my family didn't know, because they had never once bothered to ask about my life, was that the quiet, pathetic data entry jobs they mocked me for were actually cover for a boutique software analytics firm I had built from the ground up in my college dorm room. By the time my father died, I had already sold 2 proprietary algorithms to major tech conglomerates in Silicon Valley. I wasn't just financially stable. I possessed the kind of quiet, liquid, generational wealth that my parents had spent their entire lives pretending to have. When the bank came to seize my mother's assets, she finally called me. She didn't call to apologize for a lifetime of neglect. She called to demand that I use whatever meager savings I had to fix it. And, out of a misguided sense of duty, that deeply ingrained trauma bond that tells the scapegoat they must save the very people destroying them, I did. But I didn't just hand them cash. I operated through a shadowy LLC I had established years prior, Aegis Holdings. Through Aegis Holdings, I quietly bought up the debt on my mother's new luxury condo. Through Aegis Holdings, I secretly purchased the very land that the First Cathedral of Grace sat on when they faced an undisclosed zoning and bankruptcy crisis, acting as their silent, anonymous landlord. Through Aegis Holdings, I had been paying for Caroline's lifestyle, her daughter Brittany's ridiculous credit card bills, and the very ground they walked on. For 5 years, I was the sole, invisible pillar holding up their pathetic illusions of grandeur. I allowed them to keep their fake status. I allowed them to sit in the VIP sections of the church. I allowed them to parade around in designer hats, looking down their noses at the rest of the world. But instead of gratitude, my financial salvation only made them crueler. Because they didn't know I was the CEO of Aegis Holdings, they continued to treat me like the broke spinster aunt. Every time I attended a family function, I was subjected to Caroline's mocking pity. Every time I went to church, I had to listen to my mother tell her friends how she was praying for poor, lost Elise. They bit the invisible hand that fed them, day after day, year after year. I watched them operate with a sickening sense of entitlement, all while I paid the bills in the dark. I had given them every opportunity to show a single ounce of humility or grace. But today, under the suffocating heat of the July sun, when Brittany took that microphone and Caroline smiled that venomous, arrogant smile, they crossed the final, unforgivable line. They wanted to expose me as a burden to 500 people? Fine. It was time to expose exactly who was burdening who. The suffocating July heat suddenly felt like a heavy, frozen blanket draped over the First Cathedral of Grace. The sprawling outdoor pavilion, which just seconds ago had been vibrating with cruel, mocking laughter, was now plunged into a heavy, deafening silence. It was the kind of absolute quiet that only happens when the very foundation of someone's reality is being ripped out from underneath them. On the massive 30-foot high-definition jumbotron behind the stage, the church's elegant gold leaf logo had vanished. In its place, illuminated in stark, unforgiving white light, was a sprawling web of legal documents. At the very top, in bold, undeniable black ink, was the header: Aegis Holdings, LLC, Master Deed and Debt Assignment. I didn't rush. I didn't betray a single ounce of anger or panic. I simply picked up my leather tote bag, pushed my wobbly folding chair back, and stood up. Every single one of the 500 congregants watched me. The sea of pastel Sunday dresses and seersucker suits physically parted as I began my slow, deliberate walk down the center aisle toward the grand outdoor stage. The grass crunched softly beneath my sensible, flat shoes. Shoes that Caroline had mocked just an hour prior for being tragically off-brand. As I walked, I kept my eyes locked dead ahead on the stage. Caroline had frozen at her VIP table, her hand still hovering near her chest, the smug, venomous smile completely wiped from her face. Beside her, Brittany looked like she had just seen a ghost, her grip on her designer clutch turning her knuckles stark white. They were confused, but the true, suffocating terror hadn't hit them yet. They didn't understand what they were looking at, but Pastor Vance did. By the time I reached the bottom of the wooden stairs leading up to the stage, the man was practically hyperventilating. His expensive, custom-tailored Italian suit clung to his back, dark with sudden sweat. He held the silver microphone out to me like it was a live grenade. He didn't say a word. He didn't dare. He just backed away, his head bowed in a mixture of profound fear and absolute submission. I took the heavy silver microphone from his trembling hand. I stepped to the center of the stage, standing exactly where Brittany had stood just moments before to declare me a broke burden. I looked out over the sea of faces. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing, cinematic seconds. Let them sweat. Let them feel the gravity of the shift. 5 years ago, I began, my voice echoing through the massive stadium-grade speakers. It was smooth, steady, and utterly devoid of the trembling weakness they had always expected from me. When my father died, he left behind a mountain of debt that would have decimated this family's legacy. He left behind foreclosed properties, seized assets, and a reality that some people in this congregation were entirely unequipped to face. I gestured casually with my free hand toward the massive jumbotron behind me. My sister Caroline likes to tell this church that she is a woman of immense faith and independent wealth. She likes to tell you that I am a struggling, aimless burden who relies on her charity. I paused, letting my eyes lock directly onto Caroline. She was beginning to shake, her carefully manicured facade finally cracking under the blinding spotlight of the truth. What she failed to mention, I continued, my voice dropping to a cool, dangerous register, is that the luxury home she lives in was foreclosed on 48 months ago. What she failed to mention is that the platinum credit cards her daughter uses to buy those beautiful silk sundresses have been in default for 3 years. "Elise, stop!" Caroline shrieked, suddenly leaping up from her VIP table. The sheer panic in her voice ripped through the pavilion like a siren. "Turn that screen off! Pastor Vance, cut her microphone right now! This is a private family matter!" Pastor Vance didn't move an inch. He just stared at his Italian leather shoes, completely paralyzed. "It stopped being a private family matter the exact second you handed your daughter a microphone to humiliate me in front of 500 people," I replied, my voice slicing through her hysteria with cold, surgical precision. "You wanted the truth out in the light, Caroline? Here it is." I clicked a small remote I had pulled from my tote bag. The massive screen flashed, switching to a new document. It was a wire transfer receipt, deeply magnified so even the back rows could read the numbers. "This," I announced, pointing at the screen, is a wire transfer made on the first of every single month for the last 5 years. It covers your mortgage, Caroline. It covers Brittany's car payments. It covers Mother's assisted living facility. It is paid by an anonymous holding company called Aegis Holdings. The crowd began to murmur. Deacons were whispering frantically to one another. The wealthy church elders who had always sneered at me were now leaning forward, their mouths slightly open in disbelief. And as for the church itself, I said, turning my gaze to the elders' tables, I clicked the remote one more time. A massive property deed materialized on the screen. 3 years ago, this congregation faced a massive bankruptcy. You were going to lose this beautiful, sprawling property to a commercial developer. But a silent investor stepped in, bought the land, and allowed the church to lease it back for pennies on the dollar. That investor was Aegis Holdings. I turned back to the crowd, planting my feet firmly on the stage. I looked at Caroline, who was now clutching the edge of her table, her face entirely drained of color. I am the sole founder, CEO, and 100% equity owner of Aegis Holdings, I declared, the absolute power of the statement ringing through the stifling summer air. I built a software analytics firm from my dorm room, sold my first algorithm for 8 figures when I was 24, and have quietly managed a private equity portfolio ever since. I am not a broke burden. I am the bank. I am the landlord. I am the only reason any of you are sitting here today. The collective gasp from 500 people was a physical wave of sound. The power dynamic hadn't just flipped. It had been entirely obliterated. I hadn't just exposed my family's fake facade. I had revealed myself as the apex predator in a room full of people who thought they were looking at prey. The devastation was immediate, and it was glorious. For years, Caroline and Brittany had built their entire identities on the foundation of being better than everyone else. They used their fabricated wealth as a weapon to belittle the waitstaff, judge the congregation, and torture me. Now, stripped of their designer armor and exposed as absolute frauds, they were nothing. You're lying, Brittany stammered, her voice shrill and trembling. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at me. She's lying! Look at her! She drives a 2010 Honda! She buys her clothes off the rack! Mom, tell them she's lying! But Caroline couldn't speak. She was staring at the Jumbotron, recognizing the exact routing numbers and legal signatures that she had blindly signed years ago when she thought some faceless corporate entity was bailing her out. The realization that I, the sister she viewed as absolute dirt beneath her expensive heels, owned every single facet of her life, was breaking her brain in real time. I don't need to lie, Brittany, I said calmly, stepping to the edge of the stage. Math doesn't lie. Contracts don't lie. And speaking of contracts, I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. You see, the problem with being a parasite is that you eventually kill the host. I have spent 5 years silently funding your arrogance because I foolishly believed that one day you might show a shred of humility or gratitude. But today, you proved exactly who you are. You proved that my financial protection was nothing more than a blank check for your emotional abuse. And I am closing the account. I tapped my screen once. Instantly, a sharp, piercing ringtone echoed from the VIP table. It was Caroline's phone. Slowly, as if moving underwater, Caroline picked it up. She looked at the screen, and a raw, guttural sob escaped her throat. That is an automated alert from American Express, I announced to the dead silent crowd. I just remotely dissolved the trust that backs your secondary cards. As of exactly 10 seconds ago, your credit limit is 0. You have no funds. You have no safety net. Elise, please! Caroline suddenly screamed, her voice cracking as the reality of absolute financial ruin crashed down on her. The haughty, arrogant matriarch was gone, replaced by a desperate, panicked woman. She scrambled out from behind the table, her designer hat tumbling onto the grass, completely ignored. "Elise, you can't do this! We're family! We share the same blood!" "Blood?" I repeated, my voice devoid of any warmth. "You didn't care about blood when you let your daughter humiliate me. You didn't care about blood when you told your country club friends I was a pathetic spinster. You only care about blood when you need it to fund your delusions." Suddenly, the heavy, unmistakable sound of a diesel engine rumbled from the edge of the church property. Every head turned toward the main entrance of the pavilion. Rolling slowly up the manicured, pristine gravel driveway was a massive, heavy-duty commercial tow truck. Its yellow lights flashed ominously, reflecting off the crystal pitchers on the picnic tables. Brittany let out a piercing shriek. "My car! That's my car!" She bolted toward the edge of the tent, her silk dress catching on a chair and tearing slightly, but she didn't care. Parked at the very front of the VIP lot was her pristine, pearl-white Range Rover, the one she constantly bragged about on social media. The tow truck driver, a massive man in a high-vis vest, was already hooking the heavy steel chains to the front axle. "Hey, get away from that!" Brittany screamed, sprinting across the grass. "You can't take that! It's mine!" "Actually, Brittany, it's mine," I corrected her over the microphone, ensuring every single person heard me. "The title is in the name of Aegis Holdings, and since I am officially terminating your completely unearned lifestyle, I am liquidating the company's assets. The bank will have it at the auction lot by tomorrow morning." Brittany collapsed onto her knees in the grass, sobbing hysterically as the hydraulic lift whined, hoisting the front wheels of her prized possession into the air. I turned my attention back to the elders' tables. Deacon Miller, who just an hour ago had laughed right in my face, was now refusing to meet my eye. The entire hierarchy of the church had collapsed. "Pastor Vance," I said smoothly. The pastor flinched as if I had struck him. "As the legal landlord of this property, I will be expecting a formal audit of the church's leadership committee by Monday morning. I strongly suggest that any board member who cannot financially support themselves without defrauding my holding company be removed from their position immediately." I looked down at Caroline. She was on her hands and knees in the grass, desperately trying to gather the contents of her spilled purse, sobbing uncontrollably. The wealthy congregants who had been her closest friends just moments before were physically backing away from her, whispering harsh judgments, completely abandoning her the second her money evaporated. She was ruined, humiliated, broke, and entirely alone in front of the very society she worshipped. The power flip was absolute, and the vengeance was beautifully, flawlessly executed. I didn't drop the microphone. Dropping the mic is a theatrical, desperate plea for applause, and I didn't need their applause. I didn't need their validation, their shock, or their sudden, terrifying respect. Instead, I turned slowly, walked over to Pastor Vance's grand, polished oak podium, and set the heavy silver microphone down on the wood with a soft, deliberate click. That single, quiet sound echoed through the stadium-grade speakers, ringing out over the sprawling green lawns of the First Cathedral of Grace like the final, definitive strike of a judge's gavel. I turned my back on the massive 30-foot jumbotron that was still brightly broadcasting the undeniable proof of my empire and the absolute ruin of my family. I didn't look back at the screen. I didn't look at Pastor Vance, who was currently slumped against the back wall of the stage, burying his face in his trembling hands as the realization of his impending federal audit crashed over him. I simply smoothed the front of my understated, supposedly tragic white blouse, picked up my sensible leather tote bag, and began my descent down the wooden stage stairs. The oppressive, suffocating July heat that had been choking the pavilion all afternoon suddenly felt entirely different. It no longer felt like a heavy, toxic blanket meant to keep me down. It felt like a cleansing fire. It felt like a warm, undeniable breeze of absolute, unadulterated freedom. As my flat shoes met the perfectly manicured grass at the bottom of the stairs, the massive sea of 500 congregants, the very people who had laughed at me, pitied me, and mocked me just 15 minutes prior, did something they had never done before. They moved out of my way. It was a physical, visceral parting of the sea. The wealthy church elders, the judgmental choir matrons clutching their designer pearls, the arrogant youth group kids who had snickered at Brittany's cruel jokes, they all scrambled backward, pulling their chairs out of the aisle, their eyes wide with a mixture of profound awe and absolute terror. They looked at me as if I were a ghost, or perhaps a god that had just walked out of the shadows to judge them. I didn't smile at them. I didn't sneer. I didn't offer them a single ounce of the vindictive gloating they so desperately deserved. I gave them something much worse, much more devastating. Complete, terrifying indifference. I walked down the center aisle of the white pavilion with a slow, measured, and rhythmic pace. Every step I took felt like a physical chain snapping, falling away from my wrists and shattering onto the ground behind me. Step. The trauma of being handed a bus pass while my sister was handed a Mercedes. Gone. Step. The agony of sitting alone at family dinners, listening to my mother tell her friends I was a lost cause. Erased. Step. The 5 years of silently paying their debts, bleeding myself dry in the dark just to keep a roof over the heads of people who hated me. Completely, finally over. As I neared the back of the pavilion, I reached the VIP tables, the tables with the imported linen and the sweating crystal pitchers of sweet tea. Caroline was still on her hands and knees in the damp grass. The woman who had spent her entire 50 years on this earth demanding that everyone bow down to her superior status was now quite literally crawling in the dirt. Her wide-brimmed designer hat, the crown jewel of her carefully crafted Southern matriarch costume, had been trampled under the foot of a fleeing deacon. Her makeup was streaked with dark, jagged lines of waterproof mascara, and her breath was coming in ragged, ugly, hyperventilating gasps. As my shadow fell over her, Caroline slowly looked up at me. For a fraction of a second, the bustling, panicked noise of the congregation faded away. The distant, hydraulic whine of the tow truck dragging Brittany's beloved white Range Rover out of the parking lot went silent. There was only me and the woman who had made it her life's mission to destroy my self-worth. Caroline's eyes, usually so sharp and full of hawkish judgment, were wide and completely hollow. She looked at me, her lips trembling, desperately searching my face for a sliver of the weak, compliant little sister she thought she knew. She was searching for a lifeline. She was begging, without words, for me to say it was all a harsh lesson, that I would turn her credit cards back on, that I would save her one last time. I looked down at her. I felt no pity. I felt no anger. I felt absolutely nothing. I didn't say a single word. I just blinked, broke eye contact, and stepped around her as if she were nothing more than a discarded piece of trash on the sidewalk. I walked out from underneath the heavy shade of the white event tents and stepped directly into the blinding, golden afternoon sun. The gravel of the main church driveway crunched softly beneath my feet. I didn't walk toward the main parking lot where my supposed 2010 Honda was parked. That car was a prop. A brilliant, necessary piece of theater I had maintained for years to keep the leeches at bay. I had already arranged for a scrapper to quietly tow it away in the morning. Instead, I walked past the grand stone archways of the church entrance, heading toward the private oak-lined turnaround reserved strictly for visiting dignitaries. Waiting for me, idling with a low, predatory purr that vibrated deep in my chest, was a midnight black, custom-built, armored Mercedes-Maybach S-Class. The paint was so flawlessly polished it looked like liquid glass, reflecting the brilliant blue sky and the towering steeple of the church I legally owned. Standing sharply at attention beside the rear passenger door was Marcus, my private driver and head of personal security. He was dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit, his dark sunglasses completely obscuring his eyes. As I approached, Marcus didn't ask questions. He didn't flinch at the distant sounds of my family's chaotic downfall echoing from the pavilion. He simply gave a curt, respectful nod and pulled the heavy, vault-like door open for me. "Good afternoon, Ms. Elise," Marcus said, his voice a smooth, calming baritone. "The office requires your final signature on the liquidation protocols. Shall I take you to the penthouse?" "Yes, Marcus. Thank you," I replied, my voice steady, light, and perfectly at peace. "Take the scenic route. I'm in no rush." I slid into the back of the Maybach. The scent of bespoke, hand-stitched cream leather and the perfectly chilled, whisper-quiet air conditioning immediately enveloped me, washing away the humid, toxic stench of the church picnic. Marcus closed the heavy door, and with a solid, definitive thud, the outside world was instantly, miraculously silenced. The screaming, the crying, the begging, it was all completely muted, cut off by 2 inches of ballistic glass. I leaned back into the plush, massaging seats and rested my head against the headrest. I let out a long, slow exhale, closing my eyes for just a moment as the profound, intoxicating rush of total victory washed over my entire body. The powerful V12 engine engaged, smooth as silk, and the heavy luxury vehicle began to glide forward. I opened my eyes and looked out the tinted passenger window. As the Maybach pulled away, following the manicured curve of the private driveway, I watched the sprawling grounds of the First Cathedral of Grace slide past. Through the dark glass, I could see the chaos unfolding in the distance. I could see the flashing yellow lights of the tow truck disappearing down the highway. I could see the tiny, frantic figures of the church elders scrambling around the stage, staring up at the jumbotron that was still broadcasting their financial ruin. And I could see the small, pathetic silhouette of my sister, still sitting in the grass, utterly alone, entirely broken, and permanently stripped of her power. As the car accelerated onto the main highway, picking up speed, the towering white tents, the imposing brick facade of the church, and the toxic family that had tried to bury me all began to shrink. They grew smaller and smaller in the distance, fading into the heat waves rising off the asphalt until they were completely and utterly gone. I turned away from the window, picked up my tablet, and tapped the screen to review my portfolio. A calm, genuine smile spread across my face. I was a self-made titan, a woman who had turned deep, profound pain into an unbreakable empire. And for the first time in my 32 years of life, I was finally, absolutely, and unequivocally free. The transition from the suffocating, heavy air of the First Cathedral of Grace to the whispering, cool silence of the Maybach was more than just a change in scenery. It was a physical manifestation of my new reality. As Marcus drove smoothly toward the heart of the city, the sun began its slow descent, casting a brilliant, forged gold light across the towering glass and steel skyline. I looked out through the dark tinted glass, watching the world blur past. For the first time in my entire life, my shoulders dropped. The constant, low-level hum of anxiety, the visceral dread of the next manipulative phone call, the next passive-aggressive insult at a holiday dinner, the next fabricated financial emergency I would be guilted into fixing, was completely, undeniably gone. My phone sat in my leather tote bag, entirely silent. I had already instructed my security team and legal counsel to block every single number, email address, and social media profile associated with my blood relatives. They were ghosts now. And I was finally alive. There is a profound, almost terrifying clarity that washes over you the exact second you decide to stop funding your own abuse. From the time we are children, society force feeds us the toxic narrative that family is an unbreakable bond. We are told to be the bigger person, to keep the peace, and to forgive people who have absolutely no intention of ever changing. But I am here to tell you a harsh, undeniable truth. Being the bigger person to a parasite just means you are providing them with a larger meal. For 5 long years, I bled my own peace of mind dry to sustain a family that despised me. I allowed their cruel jokes, their eye rolls, and their deliberate public humiliations to slowly chip away at my soul, all while I silently paid the mortgages and the credit card bills that kept their fake, arrogant world spinning. I fell into the trap of believing that my financial utility would eventually earn me their love and respect. But respect cannot be bought from people who are fundamentally bankrupt of empathy. The most powerful, life-altering lesson I learned on that manicured church lawn is this: blood does not equal a blank check. DNA is a biological accident. It is not a binding, lifelong contract for emotional servitude. You do not owe your sanity, your success, or your hard-earned wealth to people who treat your existence as a disposable resource. Walking away from toxic family members, cutting them off completely and utterly, without a single ounce of hesitation or guilt, is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You cannot heal in the exact same toxic environment that broke you, and you absolutely cannot save people who are actively trying to drown you just to fund their own delusions. Sometimes the only way to win a rigged game is to flip the board, walk out of the room, and build your own empire from the ground up. If you are watching this video right now, and you feel the crushing, suffocating weight of a family that only values you for what you can provide, whether that is your money, your free labor, or your silent submission, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are not trapped. You are not a burden. And you are certainly not a victim unless you choose to remain one. You possess a quiet, fierce power inside of you that they are terrified of. That is exactly why they try to keep you small. They know that the exact moment you realize your own worth, their free ride is permanently over. It is time to close the account. It is time to let the tow trucks come, let the facades crumble, and let them face the brutal reality of their own incompetence. I want you to take to the comments right now and share your own stories of absolute resilience. Have you ever had to look an entitled, toxic relative dead in the eye, set an unbreakable boundary, and walk away to protect your peace? How did you find the strength to finally cut the cord? Please share your experiences below. Your story, your victory, and your courage might be the exact spark someone else needs to hear today to finally shatter their own chains. If this story resonated with your soul, and if you believe in the unyielding power of knowing your worth, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. We are not just sharing stories here. We are building an unbreakable community of strong, independent people who refuse to be used, abused, or underestimated ever again. Remember, your peace is your most valuable asset. Guard it ruthlessly, demand absolute respect, and never, ever apologize for walking away from the shadows and stepping into your absolute power. I will see you in the next video.